many friendships that we read about in the Bible, and there's one in particular that I really love, and it's the description of a tender friendship between David and Jonathan. And of course, the friendship ended prematurely because they had to part, because Jonathan's father, King Saul, had a problem with David and was trying to kill him. And we read a moving verse in 1 Samuel chapter 20 that they kissed each other and wept together, but David wept the most. And actually they never saw each other again after that. And then later Jonathan died in battle. And then about 20 years later we have a most interesting development. So we've got a great reading for Father's Day. So let's listen to the words of this passage now.
The reading today is 2 Samuel chapter 9. David asked, "Is there anyone still left in the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now there was a servant of Saul's household named Ziba. They summoned him to appear before David, and the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" "At your service," he replied. The king asked, "Is there no one still alive from the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness?" Ziba answered the king, "There is still the son of Jonathan. He is lame in both feet." "Where is he?" the king asked. Ziba answered, "He is at the house of Machir, son of Amiel, in Lo-debar." So King David had him brought from Lo-debar, from the house of Machir, son of Amiel. When Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to pay him honour. David said, "Mephibosheth!" "At your service," he replied. "Don't be afraid," David said to him, "for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table." Mephibosheth bowed down and said, "What is it that you should notice a dead dog like me?" Then the king summoned Ziba, Saul's steward, and said to him, "I have given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family. You and your sons and your servants are to farm the land for him and bring in the crops so that your master's grandson may be provided for. And Mephibosheth, grandson of your master, will always eat at my table." Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, "Your servant will do whatever my lord the king commands his servant to do." So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. Mephibosheth had a young son named Micah, and all the members of Ziba's household were servants of Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem because he always ate at the king's table. He was lame in both feet.
Okay, so let's talk about David today, shall we? I love David, a man after God's heart. And first of all, I want to talk about David in terms of him having a yes face. Having a yes face. I'll explain more in a moment. There's a verse here in our reading where David asks the question, is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake? So I just want to mention that word kindness, which actually is a translation of a Hebrew word hesed, which appears a lot in the Old Testament. And this word has various meanings, and really you work out the English translation depending on the context of the passage. And I don't actually like the NIV rendering here using kindness as a translation for hesed. I would actually say in this context that it has more the idea of loving tenderly. So really he's saying, is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can love tenderly for the sake of Jonathan? It's interesting because what David was basically saying is, I am prepared, I have a desire to love a complete stranger in a very profound, a very tender way, to give them grace. That's what he was saying. Now, let's talk about the context for a few moments. David was in a good place. He was enjoying peace, massive popularity, prosperity, and I think that he was reflecting nostalgically about the old days. I think that he was remembering his friendship with Jonathan, and as he mused about those days, he wants to show grace to a member of Jonathan's family. And that's why he asks the question of his servant. He doesn't say, is there anybody deserving? Is there anyone that's qualified? Is there anyone who's in good shape? No, what he says, is there anybody? Is there anybody in Jonathan's family? Is there anybody that I can love tenderly? He's very much showing a yes face to his servant Ziba. Ziba, on the other hand, we don't know much about him, but I would say, in contrast to David, what we see from Ziba is someone who very much has a no face, a no face. And this is his answer. Ziba's answer to King David, well, in answer to your question, there is someone, a son of Jonathan, but he's lame in both feet. David, you won't want him around. He's crippled. He doesn't fit in. He's not kingly. Can you feel the no in the words of Ziba? Today, special day, it's Father's Day. I would encourage you, say yes to your father today, or perhaps cherish the memory of your deceased father. Let's not people who have no faces, let's be people who have yes faces. It reminds me of a story by Rob Parsons, involved in Care for the Family for many, many years. He tells many, many moving stories. One that he's told frequently is about a teenager who goes home and tells his dad, Dad, I took my test and I've had the result. I got a B. I got a B in my test. And the father looks at his son and he says, can't you ever get an A? Can't you ever get an A? What was going on there? I tell you, that father was showing a no face to his son. Instead of encouraging his son, well done, son. Well done for doing well in your test. No, he says, can't you ever get an A? Those of us who have children, let's not talk to our children in that way. Let's encourage them. Whatever the age of your child or your children, let's show them a yes face, not a no face. So, still talking about faces, and we move on with our story, a great story. I love this story. I hope you do too. You may or may not be familiar with it. Let's talk about Mephibosheth, because he's obviously the central character in the story. And when we think about his face, well, I would describe it in this way. Mephibosheth, he had a frightened face, didn't he? A frightened face. He did on this occasion where unexpectedly he would meet a king. He had lived his life in a place called Lo-debar. Not somewhere that was very desirable. Lo-debar literally meant wasteland. This Mephibosheth was not wanting to be found. He was someone who would have feared execution. Why? Because he was the grandson of the previous king, which was King Saul. He may have been seen as a threat to David, and it was quite common in those days for all the family of a previous monarch to be executed. So he had lived anonymously, well away from most other people, not wanting to be found, and suddenly he thought his number was up. Because one day, before he knew it, he was whisked away in a chariot, and before he could believe it, it's quite obvious he was shaking in his boots as he stood before the king, fearing the worst. And then, surprise, surprise, with the way that David was speaking to him, and Mephibosheth, said to the king, what is your servant that you should notice, and note what he says in describing himself, that you should notice a dead dog like me. What is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me? What's he saying here? He's saying, I'm a nobody. I'm worthless. Why not just leave me alone in my miserable life down in Lo-debar on my own? Just leave me alone in my misery. I wonder whether you've ever said anything similar to that. Maybe you said something like that to God. Maybe you see yourself these days as not able to offer him very much. Maybe you've given up trying. What do I need to tell you today? I tell you what you need to hear. Are you listening? God values you. You may say, well, there are plenty of people who don't value me. That may or may not be true. But let me tell you for sure, God values you. He values you. He really does. Mephibosheth had a frightened face. He didn't think much of himself. Well, I know for a fact that there are some people who've been wearing frightened faces for the last 3 months. Why? Well, because they've been in lockdown. They're scared of this virus. They're scared to go in a shop. They're frightened about going near anybody, let alone 2 meters. They don't want to go near anyone. They're frightened to answer the door of their house. Well, if that describes you in any way, I would remind you of the commandment that comes so often in the Bible, over 300 times, do not fear. Do not fear. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Very often said by God to individuals, do not fear. Maybe God is saying that to you today. David was certainly saying that to Mephibosheth, possibly about 20 or 25 by this point. David tries to reassure Mephibosheth, says to him, don't be afraid, for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table. You will always eat at my table. Because of his friendship with Jonathan, it was ended years before, and yet still cherished and remembered with great fondness by David. He loved Jonathan so much. Because of that, David would give to Mephibosheth all the privileges and all the benefits that all of his natural sons and daughters would have enjoyed. And what's more, he would love Mephibosheth just as much as any of them. Isn't it a great story? I tell you, in this short passage of 13 verses, 4 times we read that Mephibosheth would always eat at the king's table. So you can imagine the scene in the days and the weeks and the months after Mephibosheth was invited to leave Lodebar and come and live at the palace. You can imagine the scene in the evening. The dinner bell goes. The table is laid out. In comes the king. David sitting at the head of the table. What happens next? I'll tell you what happens next. Amnon, clever Amnon. He comes in confidently to the banqueting hall and he sits at the royal table. Who comes next? Tamar. Now Tamar, beautiful young woman, she would have come in and graciously sat down at her place. Are there more? Yes, there are others. What about Solomon? Brilliant Solomon, coming out of his study, again taking his seat at the table. And then we have Absalom, handsome, dashing Absalom. He also comes in. And then last comes Mephibosheth. He comes a little bit awkwardly. He's got crutches. He slips into his seat at the table with all of David's natural children. He doesn't feel out of place anymore. He has become David's adopted son. Isn't this an amazing story? An amazing story on Father's Day of David, King David, who adopted a nobody, someone who regarded themselves as a nobody anyway, who adopted Mephibosheth as his son. Is that great news for us? You might say, why should it be great news to us? Well, God gives us many gifts. He gives many wonderful things to his people. And what is the greatest gift of all, do you think? What's the greatest gift? What would you say? I'd be fascinated to hear your answer to that question. Your instinctive reaction. What's the greatest gift that you enjoy from God? Shall I tell you what my answer is? Adoption. Adoption. You're not convinced? Read Romans 8, my favourite chapter in the Bible. Read Romans 8 to see how Paul raves about this special gift from God, that it's possible for us to be adopted into God's family. We're not born into God's family. We have to respond to him and be adopted as his son or his daughter. But what a wonderful gift. What a wonderful privilege. How do we do that? Well, I did it many years ago when I said I've had enough of living for myself. I'm going to put that on one side, and from now on I'm going to say yes to doing things God's way. And I became his child, his adopted child. And on Father's Day, I celebrate the fact that though my earthly father may have died some years ago, that I know the father of the fatherless. And I love the way he fathers me. I love it. So, as I conclude today, thank God that he loves you better than the best human fathers love their offspring. He loves you that much. And if you are his adopted son or daughter today, then he is your provider, your protector, and your promise keeper. And that is something to get excited about. May God bless you. Thank you so much for listening.